I'm Quinty Thompson with Fair Planet. Welcome to another of our Fair Talk series where we discuss with and learn from people taking action all over the world. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Colombe, Cahen-Salvador and Andrea Venzon, the founders of Atlas, which is a very exciting global political party in the making, aiming to unite the world. You work in over 134 countries, some of which you're visiting this year, and I'd love to catch up about your trip in India and the work that you're hoping to do in Australia. But before I ask you about your recent work, I want to hear about Atlas as an organization, the journey to founding Atlas and its aims and organizational structure.
Both Andrea and I have a background in politics. We first co-founded in 2016, so just as Brexit was happening. We co-founded a pan-European political party. And what this means, because those are extremely complicated words that mean basically nothing for most people. Brexit happened. I'm French, as you can hear from my accent. The far right was rising in France. Andrea, who you hear in a minute, is Italian, and same in Italy. And with a German friend, we said, look, across Europe, we face the same issues, but we also have a lot of the same dreams and opportunities. So we should be working together to counter nationalism and those bad trends across Europe. And there's very little home for young people when it comes to politics. And so we co-founded this, basically the idea of coming together across borders to work for for a better European Union, for young people to have access to politics and so on. And this political movement that we co-founded led to quite a few people being elected at the European Parliament and across Europe. And then we kind of took a step back after the European elections of 2019. And Andrea and I realized that a lot of the topics we cared about were global and not European. For example, climate is one of those topics. It can't be solved just by the European Union. Or migration. And migration for me is far from a problem. It's a great opportunity, but it's something it's a trend that is global. And the European Union on its own, looking at migration trends, will not be able to address those in an adequate manner, in a fair or in a human manner. And you can go on and on and on. And this is how we had the idea of Atlas, but I already spoke too much. So Andrea, do you want to tell us a bit about Atlas?
Of course. As Colombe mentioned, where this theory, uniting people is the way forward, and globally made more sense than in Europe only. And so we said, okay, the main issues, obviously, there is not a global political system, where Europe has one, even if it's faulty. Globally, we have some global institutions like the United Nations, but they're not democratic, they're not inclusive. As a citizen, you don't have a voice. And so starting immediately as a global political party would have been very challenging. And besides that, we also were, and still are, but a bit less, quite ignorant about global political dynamics, how to organize in different countries, what are the main political issues across the planet in different continents. And so we decided to start as an advocacy organization. So still campaigning for the political topics we care about, as mentioned before, climate, democracy, vaccine equity during COVID, with the idea of exploring and understanding whether there is common ground across cultures, across ethnicities, across regions, and whether we can unite across a certain message. We did that for 3 years. We launched several campaigns. Some were very successful, some less successful.
So basically, we brought a campaign in front of the WHO asking for it to prioritize vaccines for health workers across the world, regardless of their nationalities. Because every pandemic, we see countries holding vaccines. Normally, it's like 7 of them, basically, getting 95% or more of the doses. And then the rest of the world get them something like 2 to 5 years later. And we knew this would happen again because there was never an agreement put in place for COVID-19-like illnesses to share not only vaccines, but tech, know-how, and so on. And so we lobbied through actually very random, it was a last-minute Instagram campaign by getting health workers, so nurses, doctors, and hospital staff from all continents to say, look, we are the front line. We are literally what's keeping you alive. So distribute vaccines for health workers across the world. It's such a small part of the population, and it's a front line of defense. So we need to distribute them. And actually, Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, welcomed the campaign at the World Health Assembly, which is quite random because it's a last-minute campaign. But it did work.
It shows it's possible, that kind of unification with enough campaigning, potentially. And this is something I wanted to ask you about. Equity and your kind of founding principles of freedom, equity, and welfare, which are all unifying forces, but they can also serve to polarize in the way in which sharing resources, which we're seeing more and more with the climate crisis, with climate migrants. What is your kind of vision to overcome this polarization that people are going to have over sharing of resources and through bringing equity kind of to the center of their response, a lot of people might not necessarily want to adopt it. So what do you
No, but that's fair enough, right? So our belief is you need to unite beyond borders to solve global challenges. And to unite, you need to have a type of democratic global governance at the end of the day. The UN is undemocratic, and you can't share resources, you can't adequately, it doesn't have enough competencies and so on. But we're not apolitical. So the reason for which we want this democratic global governance is we believe it will lead to more well-being, to more freedom, to more equity. And we don't want a democratic global governance to have a Nazi-like world, right? That's not my vision of a political future. And for us, the world in which we want to live in which we want future generations to live in, is a world that is fair. And fairness requires equity. It's recognizing that certain groups have less access to opportunities, to wealth, to power, to very basic decent standards of living. That's not just individuals, but groups, whether based on characteristics such as gender, race, sexual orientation, nationality, the passport they hold, and so on, will have less access. And this needs to be front and center in any debate, whether climate, and that's where climate justice comes in, but a lot of other debates as well. For example, when in India, and I guess we'll tell you about a trip to India, we've been talking a lot about truth and reconciliation. And so as a global political movement, we want to unite. But how can you unite without having the tough discussions around past crimes like colonialism, right? How can you unite without actually acknowledging what has happened, and more than acknowledging, trying to reconcile? And this goes through, obviously, apologies, but not only. It goes through reparations, and those have to be, in a lot of cases, financial reparations. But not only. We know that past crimes impact the world in which we live in. And there's a reason for which certain countries have debt with higher interest rates. The reason is mainly racism, but also post-colonial crimes that are still impacting the world. And without addressing the past and the current inequities that exist, how can we move forward in a world that is more fair and more united? And we know it, whether we like it or not, we live in a globalized world. We live in a world in which we're interconnected. We try to stop it by having strict border enforcement or other stupid mechanisms, but we already live in a world that is interconnected. So the only way to actually address a lot of the issues is by coming together. And for this, we need equity.
And I'd want to hear about, within this structure of kind of a global democratic governance, where does citizenship lie? How does a truly humane and democratic kind of version of citizenship look for you?
So in a way, there are obviously different tiers or different steps to get to where we want to be. Obviously, in an ideal world, you would have a global citizenship that guarantees you rights and opportunities everywhere, according to just the fact that you are a human being. And that's kind of like the direction that I hope the world will take. And I think will take a lot of time. In the meantime, what we can do is to provide some very basic rights through a democratic global governance. For example, voting rights. Think about all those people that live in places where they can't basically vote. And these are autocratic governments, they exist everywhere. If there was a democratic global governance, perhaps at least part of this population could have access to the right of voting. Or let's think about very basic economic rights, I mean, without even thinking about social welfare and so on, that will take a long time to become a global topic. But at least ensuring that through a democratic governance, a minimum level of economic support can be accessed by anyone across the planet. It's something that is technically definitely possible with technology that we have today. And there is definitely enough wealth to make it happen. It's not like, I think there is a data that says they only by taxing multinationally fairly, so by closing all the gaps of the global tax system, you could feed the world twice in a year. Like everyone could have food for the whole year twice. So that means that clearly there's enough money you could, through a democratic global system, ensure that at least the massive problems of poverty, of, as I mentioned before, missing political rights, and a few basic rights could be granted to anyone. I think these are the basics of a global citizenship that will take obviously longer to come, because to get there, you need to overcome, or at least be ready to associate a global citizenship to a national citizenship that we have now, and many other steps that I think are cultural leap that might happen, but might take some time.
And speaking of citizenship, I wanted to ask you about your experience with the Tibetan government in exile and what you learned from them, what you're incorporating into your policies from discussions and so on.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting link because something that I wanted to add to what Andrea said is I think it will take a very long time to have a global citizenship, but maybe we can find in-between steps. And I think we can learn some from the Tibetan government. So my vision of a democratic world requires countries and peoples to come closer together. And for this, if you look at the European Union, it's kind of it's messed up in many ways, but it's kind of an example of what could be achieved, right? Even though you have a national citizenship, you have certain rights as a European. You have theoretically the right of free movement, for example. And this is something that if, democracies, for example, across the world started to come closer together, to work closer together in order to counter authoritarianism, but also to solve topics like climate and so on, and through more citizen participation, and as a result, by having more credibility and so on, you could think of benefits that, a citizenship to a type of democratic union, democratic league, democratic partnership, however you call it, would bring. And this gives not only benefits to individuals, but also strengthen democracy at a time when democracy is in retreat, including in democratic countries where people question it more and more because it's often outdated in the way it functions. Seeing clear benefits of more transnational partnerships when it comes to democracy might kind of revive a sense of belonging to democratic countries. So, free movements. I'm in Australia right now. Why not enable free movement between Australia, Kenya, Europe, and other geographies that are democracies? But
perhaps because of the equality does not exist in the same way, in that countries wouldn't necessarily want free movement because kind of notions of protectionism. I'd like to talk, well, not necessarily talk about the European Union, but in that with this concept, which is so brilliant that you're trying to implement, do you not worry that as it is implemented and as it grows, the bureaucracy and corruption will set in? You wrote recently about the issue of corruption and how it is just rife within almost all of these large kind of institutions. How are you planning to prevent that?
On protectionism, and I didn't answer your question on Tibet, which I need to do. On protectionism and free movement, some countries might not want to, but a lot of people do want to, right? Like most people want to have the ability to travel and experience other cultures, work elsewhere, and so on. We see it within Europe. Most people have crossed borders, whether for work, leisure, family, or something. And it's the case in a lot of countries. You see Pan-African movements across the African continent that want closer collaboration and so on. You see people that want closer partnerships between continents to enable free movement. And I think at the beginning of any major structural societal change, you have, of course, pushback from certain forces. I have a think that in a world where we are interconnected, it's time we can actually move freely. And I'm saying we, but for example, I'm French again. I can move freely in most places across the world. I have access to most places. And this is when we talk about inequity again. Whereas, as it was pointed out to me by a lot of our volunteers, it's much, much harder for someone in Kenya to have access to France or other European countries than it is the other way around. And that's kind of inequity in the first place. On your topic of Tibet and what we learned about citizenship there, so we went to visit the Central Tibetan Administration, which is basically the Tibetan government in exile, because we did some campaigns and town halls with them in the past. And they have a model that is incredible. I'm a policy geek, so I love to look at best practices. But to give you the gist of it, basically, for those of you who don't know, Tibet was invaded by China. The Dalai Lama, who was at the time the political and religious leader, had to flee and fled to India, where he still resides, and brought with him top members of his government. And he then split religious and political power and set up a Tibetan government in exile with the foresight of saying, this is probably going to take decades. We need to have a structure to keep the struggle going. And there's a few learnings here that I think are super interesting, both for democracies and for freedom struggles. The first one is for democracies, the Tibetan government in exile, despite facing a constant threat from the Chinese Communist Party, pushback and so on, is constantly innovating its own democracy. And for me, democracy is not a thing that's ever won. You need to work for it. So, for example, in settlements in exile with more than, I think, 500 Tibetans, you can create a local assembly, choose how you elect it, and then send your motions, complaints, whatever, to the central parliament. So it dissolves way more power. It's more decentralized. Second, what you see, we worked with quite a few freedom struggles, and a lot of the time, and it's normal, when you go in exile and when you fight an authoritarian country, it's going to take decades and you're going to have factions. And more than factions, you're going to lose legitimacy as a leader, right? You might have been elected 20 years before. You might have had popular support, but from people that are now across the world. How do you keep not only credibility, but legitimacy in the eyes of your people and in the eyes of other people? And I think what the Tibetan government did by establishing a judiciary, a legislative and executive branch that are elected, that have democratic legitimacy and so on, is to manage to keep one clear interlocutor for an entire struggle, number one, which is fundamental. And if you look at most freedom struggles, they really split, and you don't know who to speak to. But second, they're managing to actually serve the needs of Tibetans in exile. So Tibetans are scattered across the world. And it's been the case for 60 years, right? So theoretically, as you are scattered, your citizenship gets less, I wouldn't say meaningful, it's not the right word, but like less tangible when you don't have access to your actual citizenship, because there's not an actual Tibetan citizenship at the moment, right? But they managed to implement a type of book that you pay, so you pay a voluntary tax to, and it gives you theoretically your citizenship. I'm saying theoretically because it's not a passport or something like this. It's a document saying that you have the citizenship, the Tibetan citizenship.
Are there benefits that come with that?
There are, in the sense that the Tibetan government in exile seeks to have cultural and educational services abroad. They seek to support Tibetans. So, for example, the Tibetan diaspora, I was told in France, is the subject of a lot of transnational repression. So Chinese agents abroad threaten them, their families back in Tibet, and so on. And then the Tibetan government in exile is a clear spokesperson for those people. And I think more than this, I guess you would have to ask Tibetans, but you have a type of pride in supporting your government and in identifying as such in the midst of a struggle.
Wow. And so that's why you were kind of arguing that this model could be useful for Hong Kong and what we're going to be seeing happening to Hong Kong and, well, what is already happening to Hong Kong, but having kind of this almost much more ideal democracy. But why do you think it is that Tibet has been able to do this and other countries can't?
I think that what Tibetans would answer is that the Dalai Lama was a very strong figure that kept the Tibetan struggle together. And so it didn't splinter in many different streams or groups or organizations like happens with other freedom struggle. And having this central figure, a spiritual figure that at the beginning had also political power, and I think relinquished it 10 years ago now, helped a lot the Tibetan to find kind of a common institution they could believe into and formalize it as a government in exile. And so I think that for other struggles, way more difficult just because of this kind of like main cultural anchor is missing. I don't think it's impossible though. I think it just takes a bit more time and more willingness by the people. For example, I know that Hong Kongers had this discussion in the past. We're also part of, as a partner of some of these conversations. I think that when this happened, they were not ready yet, or at least what they said is that it wasn't the right move. I hope it's going to happen though, because as many of these freedom fights become clearly long-term struggles, Hong Kong said it won't be free in the next 3 years. We can't be sure about that. So having an alternative model that can keep the struggle alive for 20, 30, 50 years if needed, I think it's fundamental. And I think the Tibetan government, or the Tibetan model, is the one that so far have lasted the longest and with the strongest impulse. And so I really hope that many more struggles will follow the step.
I think it's one potential tool, right, in a toolbox. It's an interesting one. It might not fit every struggle because it means you need to be able to unify your voice. And this, for some, is possible. For example, the Uyghurs, I think, are trying or have set up something similar. I think the difference is also not only the Dalai Lama, but the amount of resources you have that foreign governments might be willing to give you or that you have in the first place. And I think the Dalai Lama was able to buy some of the land and so on himself for this. So it helps. But it's one of the tools. It means you need to be able to have a unified voice and a common denominator, which is not what is necessarily needed or the case for all struggles.
But I find it interesting, you're highlighting actually the power of a powerful leader and the importance of that. So as you're kind of moving on in your mission, how are you going to find these kind of leaders to carry on Atlas's message and implement your work?
That's $1 million questions. I think finding great people is always the hardest thing for any type of initiative, whether political, NGO, to even find your friends, right? Like finding the right type of people for the right type of thing is always the hardest. I think we're lucky to have started as an NGO, so we attracted a lot of activists. So the danger in politics is with people, especially. People make the strength of any political movement, but politics also attracts a certain type of people. And I'm being stereotypical here because I'm doing politics myself. But I think a lot of people going into politics do it for different reasons. Some of them have a deep desire to change society and serve others. And some of them are attracted by the lesser qualities of politics, such as fame and other things like this. And to be honest, I think we are all selfish individuals. We all have our own selfish needs, and that's okay. But in politics, something that is fundamentally very important is knowing why you're here, right? You have an enormous amount of forces pulling you in different directions, trying to influence you in different directions. So unless you know at the core of yourself why personally you're doing what you're doing, whether you would be willing to fight for this battle for the next decades, and what you're willing to compromise for it, because it's a difficult job. Unless you do that, I'm not sure you'll be the best politician. You might be a great campaigner and get elected, but for me, a good politician is someone who's capable of passing the necessary measures to serve their community, which is something very different. And since we started as an activist movement, we have a lot of people that are here for other reasons, right? That have been campaigning for years for topics that are very close to their heart and are unwilling to compromise them. So I think in this, we have started with some great leaders. I think for the future, however, we need to, and it's something we don't have yet and we'll need to figure out, we need to identify and train people. So like in any volunteer organization, some of the people that are the most present and that are really needed are not necessarily the best public leaders, right? When you volunteer, it's based on time. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to be at the forefront of it. It might mean you want to be behind and so on. So we'll need to implement some type of trainings on, how do you lead one to empower? How do you get there? How do you get your house in order financially and so on, so that you can actually deal with it and all of this? I think that's a must for political movement.
And on that note, Fair Planet we're a journalistic organization, but we also try to empower our readers to take action. And so I'd like to ask you, how can we get the people watching this involved? How can we join Atlas and join the movement?
I'll give you a easy answer and a more complicated one. The easy one is you go on our website, you're going to see a volunteer tab. Enter your data, we'll contact you, we'll bring you on board. There are many ways to support, from supporting the global teams if you have specific interests or skills, for example, communication, legal, policy, strategy, and the classic function of a political party. And then you can also have national teams together be bigger. So we have already some formal teams that are more established, like the Italian, Kenyan, Indian, Costa Rican, and a few others that we're opening all over the planet. These teams need support, need help, need brains, hearts, everything you can bring. And it would be amazing to have you with us. The more complicated answer is it's going to be tough. We're going to need help, and it's going to take a few years, I think, to get all the chapters across the planet where they should be. So in the condition of challenging elections, winning seats, and start changing policies in line, obviously, with our global vision. So it's not as easy as joining an established political party. It requires a lot of passion, a lot of dedication, working with the resources. But I definitely think that this is the future. And whether we are going to make it or someone else is going to make it, I don't know. But the direction of creating a global political front, I think, is the only one to deal with the challenges that we have today, we're going to have tomorrow, and hopefully to bring a bit of more peace, stability, and prosperity to this planet.
Amazing. Thank you very much.